A next principle, therefore, as I'm talking about some of these, that sometimes people say, like, well, then they must have made a mistake somewhere. Yes, that's the next principle I would teach. Prophets can make mistakes. Remember that the restoration kicked off with a prophet of God losing 116 pages of sacred scripture. That's how the restoration began, was with Joseph Smith making a monumental mistake and the Lord having to work with his prophet, correct it, and find ways to rectify it. But as Elder Dieter F. Uchtdorf classically taught in his November 2013 talk, there have been times in the past when, quote, leaders in the church have simply made mistakes. For example, with Official Declaration 2 on the restriction of Black Africans and priesthood and temple, as we've touched on, there were a lot of things given, a lot of reasons or justifications or explanations for that restriction by leaders of the church that were perpetuated throughout the church. Today, the church disavows those theories and says that none of them were revelatory. And Elder Jeffrey R. Holland, speaking of this issue, said, quote, "I have to concede to my earlier colleagues, they, I'm sure, in their own way, were doing the best they knew to give shape to the policy, to give context for it, to even give history for it. All I can say is, however well-intended the explanations were, I think almost all of them were inadequate and or wrong." That's a really interesting statement from Elder Holland, showing that prophets can learn and grow and therefore make mistakes that need to be corrected in the ongoing restoration, as I'll talk about with you in the next video. Well, the last thing before I conclude on this portion is, who determines a prophetic mistake? That's a big question. I one time was speaking on this subject, and afterward, it just so happened in the audience was a general authority. And the general authority came up to me afterward and said, "I appreciate how you're trying to deal with some of these nuances and complexities." But then he asked me a pointed question that I have not forgot since he asked it. He said, "I agree that prophets can make mistakes." And he said, "But who gets to determine a prophetic mistake? Is it up to us in our judgment, or is it up to God?" And that is a question I would extend to you as well who are watching this video. Tapping back into the analogy of my wife and I leading our family. For example, my wife and I have a lot of policies, we could say it that way, or even teachings, principles, dealing with technology as we raise our teenagers. Every parent out there that's dealing with teenagers and working with them, you know that technology is a new modern context that we're all trying to navigate. Well, we have certain things, and I won't say them on this video because you'll judge whether I'm making a mistake or not, and maybe we are on some things. But what's interesting is one time, as we were talking with our teenage daughters, we told them they couldn't have a certain social media platform while they were young. We said when they reached this certain age, they could have this social media platform. Our daughters freaked out on us. There's no other way to say it. They told us we didn't understand. They told us we were out of touch. They told us we were ruining their social lives. They cried, they pushed back. But my wife and I held firm on that. Now, what was interesting is now some of those daughters are older and they're adults. And as I was having a conversation recently with one of my younger daughters who's moving into her teenage years, I said to her some of our policies. You're not going to get a cell phone at this age. You're not going to have these social media platforms, blah, blah, blah. Well, what was interesting is I was telling her that, just so happened that one of my older daughters was there, and she turned to my younger daughter and said, "Listen to Mom and Dad. They know what they're talking about." And then my daughter thanked us for implementing those policies to help her during her teenage years. So we have to be careful sometimes when we rush to our quick judgments about what is and is not a mistake. Sometimes we simply don't have all the information. Sometimes we don't have all the factors. Sometimes, and a little bit of information would turn our perspective on something. Sometimes we don't see a global international church. We only see it through our lens and our experience, which is how we all understand the world. Let's just remember and ponder on that question of who does determine a prophetic mistake as a whole.